students wear it. Is that what it is?
No, it just allows them to apply it themselves.
Okay.
You
That was
are
your-
live.
Thank you. All right. Welcome back to Senate Education.
Yeah, it's really got some juice in here.
First. Representative Conlon, H 871. This is an act relating to development of an updated state aid to school construction program. The floor is yours. If you can
Thank
give
you
us
very
a little overview, and then we're going to switch to Ledge Council.
Representative Peter Conlon, Chair of the House Education Committee. H 871 basically continues the work that the last task force iteration did. And it also sort of gets things going to lay the groundwork for a program. So just a little bit of background on the task force. This last go around, it basically got a late start due to the flooding, the obligations of the treasurer's office, obligations of the AOE. And it ended up really being a bit of an unwieldy committee in order to find sufficient amount of time to meet for long periods, to take on big topics. So it did not produce what's called a fully baked proposal on school construction for the legislature. And it's also, frankly, pretty complicated thing to do. But so just to go through the bill quickly, it starts off to have the AOE put together and create a facilities master plan grant program. One of the things the task force of 2023 thought about was eligibility to qualify for state aid, and that really we want every school district to do a thoughtful plan of their future based on needs, demographics, school building condition, and all of that. But understanding that a true facilities master plan is expensive, it could really be a burden for a lot of school districts. I was chair of our school district when we went through one. I think we spent $230,000. Yeah, that includes robust public engagement, those sorts of things. So anyway, part of this is there's no money attached, but it's to get the facilities master grant program set up, organized. AOE would take that on. They are fully on board. They want to make it as sort of transparent, plug and play as possible, where it's like everything's on a number, very little, no narrative, that sort of thing. But so every district has an understanding of how they would qualify, and would they qualify.
Rep. Conlon, when we've been talking with the chair of approps here, one of the things that we're going to be pushing for are certain positions in AOE. Does AOE have a construction, somebody who is designated, would you remind me, or a team?
They have one person.
They have one person.
Yeah, his last name is Steve, even though he lives 4 doors down from me. Bob Johnson, I think it is. Anyway,
Richardson.
Donahue.
Well,
Donahue.
Donahue,
Yeah.
sorry about this.
Thank you.
very embarrassing. But he has a lot going on
Yeah,
right now. But in terms of setting this out, he and the director of operations, Jill Briggs Campbell, have said, we can make this work, we can make this happen.
so there's no additional position in the House passed big bill that has anything, no additional position for this.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
However, that then falls to the work of part 2 of the bill, which is really to create a legislative task force of 6, 3 from the House, 3 from the Senate, 1 member, the Secretary of Education or designee, to essentially operate as one of our committees, take testimony, and just start making the hard decisions, so that at the end of their work, legislative language, not a report, will be presented. And this lays out, everyone really kind of lays out the issues for them to wrestle with, things like, okay, let's say we have a funding program and it works similar to Rhode Island. Are we going to provide incentives and bonuses and what should they be? And what is going to be top priority? Is it newer and fewer, or is it health and safety, or is it energy efficiency? And at what level? The funding, the overall big bonding scheme is pretty well kind of laid out, needs some polish, but the task force looked at the Rhode Island model, especially the treasurer's office modeled it. And, in order to have the state's bonding capacity absorb what's called a fraction of the level of need, but it's still a high level. There is a methodology which, let's say $10 million of dedicated revenue could create $500 million in bonding capacity for the state. And that's based on a program where the state doesn't just hand you 30% for your project total. It contributes 30% to your annual costs of the bond. So that's why it needs an ongoing payment plan. So anyway, the other half of this bill is really about that group and its work to come back to the legislature with those hard decisions, as well as JFO modeling revenue options to fund that, as well as sort of saying, okay, what do we want to go for? That's sort of walking through all that item by item.
Can you ask you a question?
Yeah, go.
Sorry.
Yeah, go.
Is the treasurer invoked in this
No,
bill at all? Okay.
no, it's really meant to be a committee this size, just taking testimony, making the decisions and moving forward. So there's a product at the end. Right, because, I think we sort of know all the issues and now it's really the decision making that has to happen.
Great.
Gonna have to wait till after the election.
I know, but yeah.
Why?
Well, effective 1 July.
Oh, yeah. Okay, go ahead. Representative Powell.
So really, it's, so it lays out the duties of the task force. It talked very briefly about the agency of education and buildings and general services, doing some work together on a list of approved contractors, let's say engineers and architects to do the work. Again, the decisions that need to be made by the task force. One of the things that this new group would need to come up with is what's the governing body of this? So a lot of other states have a completely separate department, commission, whatever, of paid staff people who do this work. They're on the ground helping schools coming up with their best proposals. They're evaluating proposals, making decisions on who qualifies for what using a formula, and then awarding the dollars.
Do you think we should move in that direction?
Well, I think that there's a lot of support for the idea that it'd be an independent body
Yeah.
outside of the AOE, not having to share staff with the AOE, so it could be dedicated to.
Yeah, no, the only reason I ask is it could be something that if you think if we're heading in that direction, I'm sure the appropriations committee could help us prepare for heading in that direction. Finally thought, in terms of putting money aside.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be great. It could also be funded through whatever dedicated revenue stream can define. So let's just say the sports betting generated $15 million a year. We said that revenue is to be used for school construction. That could also cover the cost of a
Senator Williams.
independent board.
BOCES.
One word, BOCES, that's it.
Assess or something.
I mean, this,
Yeah.
the level of,
Cass,
this requires a level of expertise, statewide level of expertise.
Yeah.
If the goal is to help schools come
Yeah.
up with successful processes and proposals, it needs
Great.
strong expertise at the state level helping them out. So that is really the general overview, and Ledge Council will have the details for you if you go through the bill line by line. But I'll stick around for that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you guys are done?
I think I'm done. Go ahead.
Your committee's done?
Yes.
Oh, great, great. All right. Let's switch.
doing this.
You guys off the floor too? Is planning said pass?
There's something you said, Pat?
Okay, great. We're touching a little bit of that later today too. This one section. Ms. St. James.
Good afternoon, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. We are going to walk through H 871 as passed by the House. How are we on time?
Now, I'd love to be able to do it in about 20 minutes. Do you think that's possible or no?
Yes, no.
Okay,
Well,
we can go a little.
depends on your question.
If we don't
Yeah.
ask questions, definitely.
Well, you know what we're transitioning right into after is your time with us. So we have really 30 minutes, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So section 1 of the bill is creating the Facilities Master Plan Grant Program. And just to orient you, this is actually, section 1 is actually proposing to plunk the Master Plan Grant Program into Title 16. And then you'll see that there's a repeal sunset that would take it out of Title 16 when it's no longer useful. But session law is always hard to find. And the sunset is in 5 years. So if folks are going to be relying on this legislation for several years, let's put it in Title 16. So the intent of the grant, the Master Plan Grant Program, there's some legislative intent here, and that is that the grant program will enable supervisory unions and independent career and technical education districts to develop a supervisory union level vision for all school buildings that meets the educational needs and goals of the supervisory union. So I think that's an important framework to have, is that the grant program is going to be on the SU level, not district by district. The goal of a facilities master plan shall be to facilitate an evaluation of the capacity of existing facilities to deliver on identified 21st century educational goals. And it will also enable and require SUs to engage in intentional and robust conversations with the larger community that will hopefully lead to successful passage of bonds needed to support the renovation or construction needs of the SU. It is the intent of the General Assembly that awards shall be granted in accordance with this section and in a manner that allows a maximum number of SUs, independent career and technical education districts, to successfully complete facilities master plans. So this intent language is important for several reasons. It is your intent, right? It's the General Assembly's intent. But the grant program, as we go to page 2, you'll see is administered by AOE, and there is a lot of discretion here. So the intent section is giving AOE some parameters within which to administer the program. So we're on page 2. We're going to start off.
Yeah, please.
Gotta have a question. So this, page 1, line 13. 21st century educational goals. Who sets these goals? Is that envisioned?
So that is not a defined term. I believe it is a term that the education community uses quite often. And I would not be the best person to speak to that, but I believe it is a term of art that my guess is everyone sitting behind me uses.
But I think we should pull it apart, really, go back and really have a conversation to give some clarity to it.
So on page 2, line 1, we're going to start with the definition section. So anytime you see the word supervisory union, it also means supervisory districts and independent career and technical education districts. So we don't have to repeat all 3 of those terms throughout the whole section. So subsection C, this is establishing the grant program. There is established the Facilities Master Plan Grant Program to be administered by AOE from funds appropriated for this purpose to SUs and independent career and technical education districts to support the development of educational facilities master plans. Grant funds may be used to hire a consultant to assist in the development of the master plan, with the goal of developing a final master plan that complies with state construction aid requirements. Subsection D is how are those funds dispersed? So the agency shall develop standards for the disbursement of grant funds in accordance with the following. Grants shall be awarded to applicants with the highest facilities needs. The agency shall develop a prioritization formula based on an applicant's poverty factor. That is not defined here. We're going to leave it up to AOE to determine what the poverty factor is. And the average facility condition index score. The average facilities condition index score AOE already has, and that is a result of the Act 72 and the inventory that was done on all of the school buildings in the state. The agency shall develop or choose a poverty metric to use. The agency may give priority to applicants with a regionalization focus that consists of more than one supervisory union that apply as a consortium. We're on page 3 now. Award amount are going to be issued commensurate with the gross square footage of buildings located in the applicant's SU. And the agency shall develop minimum requirements for what an educational facilities master plan has to include. And at a minimum, the agency's requirements need to include the following elements: a description of the educational mission, vision, and goals of the SU. A description of the educational programs and services offered by the SU. The performance of a space utilization assessment. The identification of new program needs. The development of enrollment projections. The performance of a facilities assessment beyond what was done through Act 72. And information regarding the various design options explored to address the SU's identified needs.
So Ms. St. James, in your opinion, is there something in here that would allow the agency to say, listen, the needs are too great. The needs are so great that, and there's a school 700 feet to 7 miles away. And this is where that all those students should go. Is there that kind of?
No, this is just a grant program
Mhm.
for SUs to develop their master plan for any future construction, building maintenance, etc. That master plan may take the concepts that you are talking about as far as consolidation into account.
Okay.
And you'll see you'll see that that is a concept that is addressed in the task force, is something that the task force for the working group needs to look at.
Just curious from Senator Collins, if that particular issue was addressed in your committee during your deliberation.
Yes, and I probably would respond just the same way St. James did, in that is part of the charge of the task force. This is really just about the facilities master plan. And it could be that an SU puts together a facilities master plan, and part of that is these facilities aren't even worth putting a dime into.
Okay, good. Please continue.
And then AOE is required to report back to you all on or before December 31st annually while the program is up and running on the implementation of the grant program. So how's the grant program running? And then section 2 is at sunset. So the vision is that the grant program will run for 5 years. So a repeal on June 30th, 2029.
You can continue in that. Oh, I'm sorry. You
Sorry,
have a question?
what, this could be for Mr. Conlon, I almost said Professor Conlon, and, or you, Beth, but why the sunset in 2029?
I think maybe you should speak to that if it goes into the intent or.
Well, I think I would say 2 reasons. One, I think it was my impression that that's sort of good government policy, is that you should revisit something rather than have it be ongoing, which I think it probably was enough. And then number 2 is that the idea was, get everybody on board doing facilities master plans sooner rather than later. So if there's a deadline to it, folks will get on board.
Okay, thanks.
I'm on page 4, section 3 requires AOE and DGS to work together to develop pre-qualification criteria for architecture and engineering firms specializing in K through 12 school design and construction, and then maintain that list, make that list available. Section 4 is the working group. This is the bulk of the bill. So this is a legislative working group composed of 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate, and the Secretary of Education or designee. The working group, I'm on page 5, line 4, powers and duties. The working group shall study and create a recommended plan for a statewide school construction aid program, including recommendations on implementation. To facilitate its understanding of school construction projects and other state aid programs, the working group may conduct site visits. And in creating its recommendations, the working group shall address the following topics, and we're going to walk through those topics. building upon the recommendations contained in the task force report from this past summer. And are you all familiar with the status of the state aid to school construction program now? Seem very puzzled look.
Well, isn't there a moratorium?
Yes, so there are laws on the books. There is a whole chapter in Title 16 about state aid to school construction, and it has been paused since 2007. So I just wanted to, we're starting from scratch here, the working group. So these are the topics that the working group has to consider, and I will just spoil it all for you. There is a catch-all at the very end that says, anything else I have not, Beth St. James has not talked about, they still get to consider, okay? So the first topic is governance. As Rep. Conlon indicated, different states do things differently. The working group is charged with recommending what the governance model for Vermont should look like, including recommendations on staffing levels and a stable appropriation for the funding of the recommended governance structure. Page 6, prioritization criteria. How do we figure out where the money should go? The working group has to make recommendations on state aid prioritization criteria that will drive funding towards projects that are aligned with the state's educational policies and priorities. Eligibility criteria, who's even eligible for state aid school construction? So the working group has to consider at a minimum the following eligibility criteria: appropriate maintenance and operations budgeting at the SU union level, a requirement for eligible SUs to have a 5-year capital plan, a facility condition index maximum level that would preclude eligibility, but may qualify a building for a state share percentage bonus to replace the building, and we'll talk about state shares later. A requirement for an SU master planning process that would require consideration of the adaptive reuse of schools for housing or other social infrastructure. And a prohibition on exclusionary zoning regulations that would preclude lesser resourced families from living in the applicable school district. State base share. The working group has to make a recommendation as to whether a state-based share is appropriate, and if so, whether it should be based on student or community poverty factors. So the concept of a state-based share, please correct me if I get this wrong, is does everyone get 10 grand right off the bat? Doesn't matter if you meet any of the other eligibility criteria. Is there just a base share that the state gives to you? Did I get that right? Okay. And then the working group is also tasked with considering other factors such as local taxing capacity, student poverty data, environmental justice metrics, and energy burden metrics. Page 7, incentives. The working group shall consider the use of incentives or state share bonuses that align with Vermont's educational priorities with the goal of efficient and sustainable use of taxpayer-supported school construction aid to improve student learning environments and opportunities. So the incentives that they have to include are school safety and security, health, educational enhancements, overcrowding solutions, environmental performance, newer and fewer buildings, major renovations to improve systems educational alignment and capacity, replacement of facilities with a current facility condition index of 65% or higher in combination with other policy area incentives, and schools identified with actionable levels of airborne PCBs and other identified environmental hazards and critical education spaces. Page 8. Some of these are set up as the working group shall consider, and some of them are you have to make recommendations, but you don't get to consider whether to include this topic. And this is one of those you don't get to consider whether to include that topic, assurance and certification process. So the working group has to make recommendations for an assurance and certification process. And at a minimum, that process should consider a district's commitment to adequate funding for ongoing maintenance and operations of any state-funded improvements, a district to assure adequate training for facilities and custodial staff to properly operate and maintain systems funded through state aid, a district to complete a full commissioning process as a requirement to receive state funds at the end of the project, and a clerk of the works throughout the lifespan of the project.
What is a clerk of the works? I don't think I've heard that.
I think it's like a project manager.
Yeah, figured, just wanted to check, thank you.
That could be someone at a BOCES. Just saying.
Let's see, the working group shall also consider whether the assurance and certification process shall be eligible for state funding support, as well as whether a preferred vendor list for the commissioning process is clerk of the works. I am on the very bottom of page 8, line 19, environmental hazards and contaminants. The working group shall make recommendations that approach environmental hazards and contaminants in a comprehensive manner, incorporating existing programs into the school construction aid program where possible. Pre-program construction aid. The working group shall consider whether and to what extent state aid should be made available to school districts that begin construction prior to the establishment or renewal of a state school construction aid program. So if you all enact a bill next year, it doesn't take effect until July 1, 2027. If a school district starts a construction project on July 1, 2026, is that school district eligible for those 2026 costs prior to the state aid going live? I'm on page 9, line 7, current law. The working group shall review state statutes and state board of education rules that concern or impact school construction and make recommendations to the General Assembly for amendments necessary to align with the working group's proposed construction aid program. So there's already current laws on the books, so let's look at those. We just repeal them all from scratch. There's some useful things, but also what this section sweeps in is literally any other state law that could touch on a school construction aid project.
Senator Williams.
Was any consideration given to, net carbon zero status, or, I know they do that for industry.
So the next topic is efficiencies. But I would say in the current category here, when I say literally every state law, if there is a state law out there about new building and efficiencies, the working group should be looking at that and seeing how that fits into the state aid for school construction aid program, Act 250. The environmental justice bill. Historic preservation laws.
So all
All
these
of
would,
them. Fire and safety,
all these apply to these.
to buildings,
Anyway,
projects.
yep, okay,
How do they factor into this program?
yeah. Please.
I assume that, so going back to page 8, line 1, I assume that in the House committee that, the potential conflict between continuing PCD testing and not, that this, in this bill, that line 1 being that this incentives apply to those schools that have identified PCBs. Must have been a bit of a conflict, must have been a bit of a conversation on whether continue or pause, because this is clearly an incentive to for those that we have tested and found to.
So I would answer by saying, we felt it was something that the task force should at least look at. Especially if you are a school that is under the 4-year EPA timeframe and you're ready to go ahead with a project, should that get a higher incentive? It's just something to consider. It's basically affecting those schools where they're a done deal. They've already been tested. They've already been found to have above the school action level.
Some comment, was there any conversation, and perhaps I missed it, about, one of the things we've talked about in this committee are buildings that aren't PCUs that could be sometimes appropriate for schools. I mean, we know that there are a lot of buildings out there that wouldn't be appropriate, but there may be buildings that, gosh, it is a good fit and it, people are transitioning out of it. Anything like that?
Well, sorry, did you say buildings that were schools or that could become?
Could become schools.
I think there's something in here about looking at new construction, but I would say that that concept did not probably cross our minds, that there are buildings out there that could be schools that currently aren't. That just brings up flashes of department stores that are
I know,
converted into high
I
schools.
know, no, I know. There are also some incredible historic buildings, I'm thinking in my community that frankly, yeah, who knows, and they should be at least considered perhaps, and then of course, there are some buildings in my community that were schools. That aren't schools and people are sort of repurposing some of those as well.
This does speak to that.
To that, okay. Center Weeks,
No,
no, okay,
fully on board.
please.
We are on page 9, line 12, efficiencies. The working group shall identify areas where economizations or efficiencies might be gained in the creation of the program, including pre-qualification of consultants in this area and cost containment strategies such as the use of building templates for new construction. Some states literally have like a catalog where you get to pick from your building template.
Yeah.
Page 10, fiscal modeling. The working group shall align the proposed construction aid program with fiscal modeling produced by JFO. School construction planning guide. This is I believe this is a document put out by the agency. And it exists because we had a state aid school construction program. So the working group is tasked with looking at that and making recommendations for any amendment necessary to align with the working group's proposed construction aid program. Here's the catch-all. Working group may consider any other topic, factor, or issue that it deems relevant to its working recommendations. And then subsection N was added through an amendment, which is why the additional considerations is not the last, and that really bothers me. Population considerations. The working group shall consider and make recommendations as to whether, and if so, how, the unique needs of different populations shall be taken into account in developing the program, including the following population: elementary students, high school students, SUs with low population density, and any other population the working group deems relevant to its work and recommendations.
Terrific.
So those are all of the things that we recommend. Page 11.
And just a second, get Robert's column. In that section, like about population decisions, it's all about students. So I'm wondering if there was any thought about where these administrative units go, like where their buildings are. Typically they're kind of like on the side of a high school or what have you. Is that ever a consideration that if we, as we create this plan, that their office space also needs to be considered as a population?
So not specifically, however, I think when you ask a supervisory team to do a facilities master plan, hopefully they are the ones taking that into account.
The bill is set up so that this is a supervisory union level vision. So I do think that would sweep in supervisory union offices as having to be taken into account.
It's not subdivided as a
A population,
population.
no.
I think it should be.
In this case, populate, yes, I definitely hear what you're saying. I think population was like, okay, should we have a stronger incentives for something that is perhaps combining 3 high schools into one in terms of a population group?
I think perhaps demographic may have been a better choice of word. I wrote this, so I can criticize it. So we're gonna go on page 11, subdivision 2, line 1. This lists entities that the working group has to consult in developing its plan. So usually when you see a working group or a task force, you just assume that they are going to take testimony from anyone they deem relevant to their work. We are going to make the same assumptions about this working group, but we're going to also box them into hearing from these specific folks. AOE, Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Public Safety Division of Fire Safety, Natural Resources Board, Agency of Commerce and Community Development, the Division for Historic Preservation, U.S. Department of Education, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, School Boards Association, Superintendents Association, and anyone else.
Shame.
Have actually, this question might be for Representative Conlon though, but have all of these agencies or departments expressed that they want to provide input, or have they taken a neutral stance? Have they?
No, they have not. And there are sort of reasons behind each one as to why our committee felt that they should be consulted. So US Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, well, they actually have federal funding available for schools. Winooski, for example, got a fair amount of money from them. Natural Resources Board, should we be looking at schools not built in flood zones? Right, look at Montpelier High School, you know, if you were replacing that, you'd build it right there in the flood zone. So each of these sort of have something that we felt should be touched on, but not necessarily an in-depth, like they need to come up with their proposal for the committee.
Thank you.
And that dovetails nicely with the next one, the next subsection, assistance. The working group, because this is a legislative working group, is going to have the administrative, technical, and legal assistance of the Office of Legislative Counsel, the Joint Fiscal Office, and the Office of Legislative Operation. I am not an expert in Act 250. I am not an expert in historic preservation. I am not an expert, so right, so you
Yeah.
want all of those agencies to be able to help you. And then the working group on page, the very bottom of page 11, is the charge with submitting its findings and recommendations in the form of proposed legislation, so no reports. Page 12, Office of Legislative Counsel called the first working group to her on or August 1st of this summer. The working group has to select co-chairs from among its members, one from the House, one from the Senate. A majority of the membership shall constitute a quorum, and the working group ceases to exist on December 31st, 2024. Working group gets per diem. And then section 5 is the appropriation. So there is $15,000 appropriated from the general fund in fiscal year 2025 for the purpose of funding travel by the working group and the per diem and reimbursement expenses. And then the bill would take effect on July 1, 2024.
Big center limits.
Okay, so it's phenomenal work. Stuff in that school. I was wondering on page 7.
Preservation, that's why one of the groups that has to be consulted is historic preservation. I think that reflects what we heard a lot, frankly, from other states was that go and you're not built. So yeah, I think you probably not just the way we have it basis.
That's fair. And then say to anybody in the committee, but I'm wondering because it's not outlined in here anywhere schools fall, or if they're even in this concept.
They're not really this concept because they don't get state aid.
How about specialized schools? Those schools for, I don't know what the right word is.
Therapeutic.
Therapeutic, thank you.
Unless they're publicly owned, they do not qualify.
Thank you.
Great.
And I will just say, remember that everything we just walked through to consider and then make recommendations on. But they may say, that's nice, we considered it and no, thank you. Right? So just because there is a term or a concept listed here does not mean that the state aid for school construction program will encompass that term or concept. It just means that the working group has to consider it.
So going back to your bill, what about anything special for deaf, hard of hearing,
Oh,
deaf, blind students, special needs students? Are we gonna make any new constructions, facilitate those types of students?
I don't understand your question.
Well, I'm just thinking that as long as we're building them, we're gonna take all education needs into
so certainly ADA compliant.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that would fall under the catch-all lines and accessibility.
the testimony from. That
I
we,
think it's a great idea.
Mind if I made a suggestion on piggyback on that? I mean, just from my limited experience of building a high school right now, I would say go beyond ADA, do like universal design. I think ADA bar is not high enough, but we had to grapple with that a lot in our new building. We wanted to have this giant, beautiful staircase in the foyer, and after we heard from folks in the community that, that just wasn't universally accessible. So